a very long gestation period, but it's good that I keep reminding ourselves in a kind of self-congratulatory way. If we had acted with all deliberate speed and brought out a book in, let's say, 2013, it would be so blown out of the water and irrelevant that clearly, the Holy Spirit was involved in delaying this as long as it was. Wonderful participants. I'll come back and say some things at the end, but it was very critical. I mean, so much of the discussion, I think, today and in the book and stuff was focused on, what the next generation. This is true across the religious landscape, particularly, it's become more and more true as, there's always been a sense that in American religion and I don't think only in the United States, that people sort of drift away from the religious training of their youth when they're in their late teens and 20s, and then can normally be expected to kind of come back in as they get married and feel like, well, we got to do something about the kids and the adults and so on. The evidence is that that's happening a good deal less than it used to be now. And so a lot of focus is on what's going to happen to young people. And so it seems completely stupid to have a bunch of old people monopolize the entire conversation and then leave at the end wondering about young people. And so that was critical. So it wasn't critical to have younger voices really have their day, not just, please ask a question, otherwise sit in the back and shut up. And so Mike has assembled this crew up here. I urge them, but I think it's completely unnecessary to be absolutely honest. There are no prelates here to take care of. We want to hear exactly what your reactions are, and so they have determined their order, and it will go Emily Kate Martichello, who is an undergraduate in business with a minor in Catholic studies, will go first. Then Jacob Torbeck, PhD candidate in theology and ethics. Kathleen in the same program, Kathleen McNutt, and we will end up with a historian, because that's the theme of this book. Historians talking about the future. Mark, so take it away, kids.
Hello. Thank you, Mark. So I started, as Mark said, I'm a business student. I go to the Keunwoo School of Business, and my specialty is management and finance. I especially enjoyed my business ethics class, and this led me to an idea of Catholic social teaching and economics. And so that was originally what I was going to speak about, but also within the program it mentions that we're responding to a lot of the points given by all of our other speakers this weekend. And so I didn't want to just present a new subject of Catholics and economics, because I think it does tie into the response that I ended up formulating. So I am going to talk about young people in the church. I think we have been talking a lot about it. I was fortunate enough to be able to write a paper while I was in Rome with Father Wrenches, who is a professor at the Gregorian in Rome. And my paper was on young people in the church, and I'll just read you the title. Load. Vessels of Modern Hope, Youth of the Church. So I ended up analyzing a lot of different papal documents and audiences the popes had with young people, starting with John Paul II and going to Pope Francis. And over the span of all of those conversations, the primary theme that the popes want to talk to young people about is hope. So I want to first take a step back and define what young people and the church means. In preparation for the Synod on Youth, the Curia defined young people as people ages 16 to 29. So I think each of us up here fall somewhere within that, and then I know all the students in the audience yes, fall within that age group. Some people also will extend that from 11 to 35, but I'm going to go with the curious definition of 16 to 29. So first I want to start with who are young Catholics, like people who are continually practicing, showing up in the church. There's also this big disruption that happened recently, and I think it's something that's important for me to personally talk about, and then also just as a scope to frame in my generation. Not to date myself, but I was 5 years old when the 2002 the Boston reports came out. So my parents didn't talk to me about it. It was something that was swept under the rug, and I did not fully understand what a lot of that meant until this July when the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out. That was the first time that a lot of the church abuse crisis kind of landed on my doorstep. So I think in a lot of ways it's interesting to encounter it for the first time when I know a lot of the older generation has been hearing about this for most of their adult faith life. And then focusing on Catholic youth who are continually practicing. So I want to talk about the people who like butts in the pews, right? Like people who are going to church every week. In wake of that grand jury report in July, very millennial, but I saw a tweet from a fellow young person, and it really resonated with me. And it was like, we no longer want iPads in youth ministry. We don't want concerts anymore. We don't need praise and worship. What we really need is a reintegration and a dedication to the sacramental church and to justice. So an understanding that these like flashy things to draw people into the church are not going to sustain their faith lives. What we need is justice and conversation and continual turning towards the truth offered by the Catholic Church. So that's the first thing. And then I also mentioned, I wanted to talk about Catholics encountering economics through Catholic social teaching. And when I realized why I wanted to do that, a lot of it is because of this idea of vocational discernment, right? So a lot of your practical integration of your vocation in everyday life is how you interact with the economy. And so I think a big question hanging over so many young people's heads is this idea of vocation. I know a lot of local parishes. I'm from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and we pray a prayer for vocations at the end of each Mass. That's a lot of pressure to be sitting in Mass and to hear everyone around you praying for the profound grace and Holy Spirit to come and find our young people and give them like their true calling. And so I just wanted to like contextualize that for a lot of you as well, because I do think it's something that's very important to pray about, but it's something that we pray about and then don't have a conversation about anymore, right? So it's done, move on, and it's up to you to figure out what your vocation is. I'm gonna.
Is that okay?
The shades are coming up. Just gonna give it a second. Okay, I think we're almost done. So yeah, I want to bring up this point of vocational discernment and how one thing that really helped me leaving the Archdiocese of Cincinnati and coming to school here was Ignatian discernment. One of the things that resonated with me through campus ministry and a lot of the resources here was this idea that it's not always, like vocation isn't picking between a good choice and a bad choice. That's an obvious choice. Vocation is picking between two good choices and deciding which one the Spirit's calling you to. So that was another point I wanted to talk about. And then I just attended a symposium at Georgetown, this Catholic Social Teaching and Market Thought. And I brought this book to reference, but it's called Catholic Modern, and it's by James Chappell, and he explores the church in Europe post-World War I, going all the way up to Vatican II. And the chapters about post-World War I young Catholics resonated with me profoundly. And a lot of it was because he frames this understanding of where our place is in history as Catholics. Like there's this very important, trying this journey to figure out where your place is in history. And I think why young people today really do relate to a lot of the things young people of post-World War I Europe were talking about is because there's this disillusionment and distraction. Something profound is changing, and you feel this responsibility to take a part of history, but there's not always an answer on how. So I think post-Vatican II, we have a long distance now, our generation. We're now 2 generations away from the people who were sitting at Vatican II. And so now there's this trying through our vocational discernment and return to justice to figure out what our place is in history as we do take on this heavy responsibility of carrying on the future of the church. Thank you.
I think what we'll do is have a series of comments, and then we'll open up the discussion. So please.
Are we here? Ah, there we are. Well, I'm Jacob Torbeck, as my name card says, and I think when we talk about demographics, I'm the oldest of the 4 of us and the only parent, which puts me in a strange spot to talk about young people because I also chase young people on a regular basis. In some ways, I thought this should be about clerical sexual abuse because that's what's been on my mind lately, but I found myself just too angry to say anything productive. Many of us have given up caring about the problem, except that we just want it fixed and we want people to sort of make just recompense for the bad thing that they've done. So what I'm going to do instead is pivot to another issue that is important to me as both a professor and a parent, and that is how we form young Catholics in this sort of changing world of decreasing religiosity. Dr. O'Connell-Killen begins her introduction in part by citing some very sobering demographic statistics, which I'm going to briefly reiterate and expand. So since 1965, the number of Catholics participating in the sacramental and institutional life of the American Church has fallen precipitously. And while the number of Catholics as a portion of the U.S. population is kept somewhat steady through the influx of immigrants, the proportion of Catholics that said they attend Mass every week has been roughly cut in half, from just under half of those practicing Catholics, 48% of Catholics attending Mass weekly in 1970, to under 25% in 2017. And this is despite an overall increase in the number of Catholics in the United States by about 50% over roughly the same 50 years. So what this looks like is if you conceive of an imaginary parish that had 1,000 members in 1970, it might now have 1,500 Catholics within its borders, but whereas in 1970 you look around at Mass and see 480 folks, today you're going to see less than 350. Back then you might have had 3 priests, now you will have 2, and in 10 years in places like Chicago, you will have 1, if any. So I'm not a statistician or a sociologist, so I'm going to refrain from commenting on the whys and hows of why this might be, except to say that if we look at any graph of religion in America over time, we're going to see a downward trend in membership as a percentage of American population in all major forms of Christianity. At the conclusion of the volume, Dr. O'Connell-Killen leaves us with several predictions as where this might lead. One is a post-subcultural church that is smaller, more diverse, and actively chosen by its members, but it's also one where disconnection and contestation still exists among its members, and where issues such as sexuality and gender are still at the forefront, and one whose public face is diffuse and confused. As a theologian with a strong interest in how Catholics are formed and educated, this trend is more than a little worrisome, so I'm going to talk about my feelings. Specifically surrounding the notions of a smaller but still disconnected and pluriform church. And I want to say that Mark will probably pick some of this up when he talks about polarization in the media. So, as a Catholic theologian who grew up being formed in Protestant worship, I used to be non-denominational. Sitting in the front pew, my mom played piano and the organ. It makes sense to me when theologians like Tim O'Malley or sociologists like Andrew Greeley argue that Catholics are formed in their faith through their worship and their liturgy. And I don't mean simply ritual actions, nor simply a sacrament, nor simply the homily, nor simply the sacred space in which these occur, but all of these together, blending in with local culture, have historically been the way Catholicism has been shaped into the pluriform unity that in turn shapes us. And unity here is conceived of as not uniformity. Just as Veritatis Legitimi says, or better, to quote Bono, "We are one, but we are not the same. We get to carry each other." We see the remains of American pluriform Catholicism in the edifices of formerly ethnic parishes. We have 2 parishes in my hometown of Effingham, Illinois. One used to be German, one used to be Irish. They will not cooperate, get along, or share buildings, even if the diocese makes them share priests, because there aren't enough priests to go along. But they don't remember why they're still fighting, but they've been fighting since they were ethnic parishes. Politically also, they're fairly identical. There's no difference in political views. They're all very, very traditional conservative parishes. So there's that. And we see a new kind of pluriformity in the increasingly Latin and Hispanic composition of many parishes. And finally, and this is part of what troubles me, we see a new pluriformity in the polarization of bishops and priests and their congregations along American political party lines. When I visited a suburban parish in Missouri not long ago, the pastor in his homily went out of his way to downplay the harm that Nazism does to American society. At my urban parish back home, racial injustice is roundly condemned. A friend of mine, having moved to a parish in Indiana, stopped going to Mass altogether rather than be subjected to the far right-wing political bent of the homilies there. And these homilies are not simply an invocation of civil politics from the pulpit, but they also often dictate which of the church's teachings are emphasized or spoken about at all. Church shopping, as it is sometimes called, is now not simply a matter of which parish is Irish or which parish has the better ministries, Mass times, opportunities, homilies, music, and so on. One's parish membership now often includes a political component that tracks with American civil politics. This dichotomous pluriformity worries me, but not because ideological diversity should not be possible. To the contrary, Catholicism is and always should be, as Joyce says, here comes everybody. But it's this kind of polarization within pluriformity, or rather let me reemphasize, it's that this kind of polarization within pluriformity opposes any kind of unity that doesn't include uniformity. Each camp in this polarized political landscape imposes gerrymandered lines of anathema regarding which kinds of theology and church teaching to which it would lend docility. And you see this when you look at the kinds of people and issues that are trotted out, which saints are venerated. It's very strange to me. If you go to a parish in rural Illinois, there will be a lot of people who are super into St. Teresa of Calcutta. There will be people super into Padre Pio, whereas you might get people talking about Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day at other parishes. And so it's almost as if the canon of what counts as tradition or authoritative church teaching is entirely separate from one parish to the next. And this is incredibly problematic. Post-subcultural Catholics, such as the ones the book talks about, which might be all of us soon, have become not in all cases leaders, but often followers of the American political zeitgeist, and so I suspect that unless something changes, Catholic parishes will be increasingly mirrors of the politics and polarization of their surroundings. I'm open to change in both the Catholic Church and civil society. Somebody please get on that. And my second and final concern is this. As a parent and a professor of theology, many Catholics in my courses are mostly unfamiliar with the tenets and stories of the faith they proclaim to be theirs. If fewer Catholics are being formed in liturgy, or if fewer Catholics are being formed in a manner commensurable to others, even of their own generation, the task and role of the professor of theology and any religious educator or anybody who's doing this from K through college has to be radically reconceived. We have not been adequate to the task. In many of these cases, while the name Catholic remains, the content of faith, if present, is nascent and or dormant, and it doesn't strike me as if talking about sort of my freshmen, and this isn't true in all cases, but as I try to get them to work with the content of the faith, I find that the content of faith, the tools with which I hope that they will be working, are simply not there for me to ask them to work with. We have to sort of stop and go back and do a kind of ground level catechesis in my introduction to theology class. Else there's no possibility of doing actual theology. So I think that in many ways, the conclusion of the book is right. Catholics will be a smaller portion. They will be diffuse, they will be diverse, and they will be Catholics by choice. And so I think the future of the Catholic Church in the United States seems very much to comport with the insight of Karl Rahner. Christians, Catholics of the future, are going to be mystics and engaged with their faith very much, or not at all. And that's my response to the book.
Okay, as Mark said, my name is Kathleen. I'm a PhD student in theology here at Loyola. And I'm a millennial woman, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And I'm always hesitant to do this, right? When I first decided to become a theologian, people said to me, oh, so you're going to be a feminist theologian. And I bristled at that at the time when I was younger. And I thought, you know, why does it have to have a qualifier on it? The older I get, the more I think, yeah, I am. You know, I am a feminist theologian. So just a little bit of context. I am a millennial, a mid-range millennial, not a young millennial, not an old millennial. And as the book points out, we are leaving the church at a higher rate, not only millennials, but millennial women in particular. And as one of the chapters that we heard about pointed out today, women leaving the church has an outsized impact, right, because of the traditional roles that women have played in shaping future generations. And that's kind of a double-edged sword for me. I mean, one is it really acknowledges the extent to which women's work and women's labor has been an important part of the Catholic Church that often goes taken for granted or unacknowledged in ways that I think are becoming more apparent. And the other part of that is, you know, presumably, it's also important that in and of itself that we're leaving, and not just for, you know, the effects that we might have as parents and religious educators. I know that that wasn't the intent of that particular statement in the book, and I think it's very true. But I find in many ways that the language around women in the church is very much, and as it should be, relational, right? But it's very much relational in the sense of Pope Francis speaks of us as mothers and brides, and the church is a woman. We need a deeper theology of women. Women are strawberries on the cake of theology, and other statements like this that sort of bristle even to those of us who are really encouraged by this Pope and much of what he does. So to contextualize myself, my parents grew up in that sort of what we were talking about yesterday as the non-existent golden age, right, of the parish enclave, where the Holy Trinity was the Catholic Church, the Democratic Party, and the Boston Red Sox. And Megan knows what I'm talking about. I did not grow up in that, but I grew up with a sort of cultural memory of that as being very effective in my life. But many of my aunts and uncles left. And so, the world is different. And millennial women are leaving. So I'm not offering a program to get us back, because as Cardinal Supich said last night, it's not all about numbers, right? And that the church of the future will be pluriform, and it will be a church of choice, for better or for worse. So I'm not saying, here's a prescription to get young women back into the church. I'm sharing my experience, and it's a very limited experience, right? I'm privileged, I'm, some would say, overeducated, and I speak from a very particular position as a woman and as a theologian. One of the things that was mentioned last night was this idea of church as an inverted pyramid, where those who are in the hierarchy are meant to serve those who are in the laity. And I think that's wonderful, because I think it really echoes the Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which is all about inversion of power structures. But I want us to be careful when we talk about these things. I think that sometimes there's a rhetorical move when power comes under criticism to say, oh, well, it's not power, it's servanthood. But when it's otherwise convenient, it is power, right? So we can't have the rhetoric of the Magnificat, the language of the Magnificat, without really putting it into practice. And I see many ways today where it is being put into practice. The church is at the margins. The church is very good at that. But we have blind spots. And a lot of those blind spots are around women. I mentioned a few comments of Pope Francis, who I think is listening to women, and as Cardinal Supich was talking about yesterday, listening to women is very important. Other things he said include that every feminism ends up being a machismo and a skirt. I want to note that the most recent apostolic exhortation, the post-synodal exhortation that came out the other day, speaks of feminism in a less negative light. It says we don't have to accept all of what feminism offers, but it doesn't criticize it wholesale, as oftentimes the Pope and the statements of the hierarchy have done. So I think that we need to listen to women, and we need to listen to feminism, not because women are doing a power grab, but because feminism critiques power. And critiques the ways in which power operates. And as such, it has a lot to say about a lot of things that maybe people don't directly connect with feminism. I think it has a lot to say about the abuse crisis and the cover-up crisis, because it critiques power, not because it is grabbing for power, not because it is machismo and a skirt. I've never been what some of my friends in the academy and religious life call a frustrated priest, a woman who hasn't been able to be ordained. So that particular part is not personal for me. But I once read in a book that the reason that the Roman Catholic Church does not ordain women is that they would be priestesses, and that priestesses serve goddesses. Now, not only is that historically inaccurate, as many priestesses served male gods, it also implies that God is a man, which is against Orthodox church teaching. So, when language like that is used as justification and as explanation, and this was an eminent scholar. It was a book we were using in an RCIA program that I was working with, and people bristled. So, why are millennial women leaving? Sometimes it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. It's feeling great hope and then feeling that pulled away. It's, I think of 2012 as a really big year. There was a criticism of a book by Elizabeth Johnson. There was the visitation of the women religious in the United States. More recently, the resignation of the editors and staff of the Vatican Women's Magazine. I want to say also that I really appreciated Dr. O'Connell-Killen's image of her hope for the church as a space where people come to be honest about what it means to be human. And so I wanted to mention, what do we hear from our church about what it means to be human and what it means to be women? And when we stay, I think it's because we hear the truth. Even when we don't see our lives reflected in some of the language about women, if we stay, it's because we see some other possibilities. We see this pluriformity and these different ways of being church, and I've been lucky to see many of these as well. I'm discouraged by things like, diocese moving to all-male altar servers and things like that. I'm encouraged by other things, but I think not only do we need to listen to women, but we need to listen to women and feminists, and to not only to promote equality of power in the church, but to live more fully as church with the full humanity of every person involved.
Oh, hello. Yeah, there we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Newhagen. I'm a senior here at Loyola University of Chicago. I am a double major in history and religious studies with minors in Islamic world studies, Arabic language, and Catholic studies. So I'm quite involved. When I was reading the book, I was really struck by this idea of how diverse Catholicism is today. There is the multiform, I'm trying to forget the language, pluriform, there we go. Pluriform Catholicism with, especially with the chapter on liturgy, that people can go to whatever liturgy speaks to them the most and whatever characterizes their political, theological leanings or everything like that. And that really works into something that I've been working and struggling on with as a young Catholic and scholar, and that's Catholic media. Here at Loyola, I've been honored to be part of something called the McNutt Seminar, where it gives the opportunity for young students to do projects, independent research projects on American Catholic history. And I've chosen this year to work on a famous figure in American Catholic history, Mother Angelica, the founder of the Eternal Word television network. I was talking to a friend last night, and I was talking about my project, because that's what you do on a Thursday night. And I was like, oh, it's this founder of EWTN, like, most people know her, and he's like, I don't know her. Then I just showed him a picture of her, and she's like, I know her. So she's kind of this figure over American Catholic history, and surprisingly, not a lot has been done on her and her legacy, her channel and everything. And it's definitely everything that we've been talking about today about polarization, diversity is very much, from my view, rooted in this one woman and her work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how I saw her legacy and her work reflected in the content that we've talked about today. And so Mother Angelica had founded a channel called Eternal Word Television Network, which is currently the largest Catholic media program in the world. It's shot in it's shot in the United States, but it's beamed to 100 different countries all around the world, tons of different languages. And there's this one nun who's had this show called Mother Angelica Live that ran from 1981 to 2001 until she suffered from a stroke and had to retire from public life. And she has there's almost two different eras of Mother Angelica. So there's the 1980 to 1993, like I call it, where if you watch her show, it's surprisingly apolitical. Very much talks only about stuff like St. John Bosco. When she talks about stuff like feminism, it's very much in a roundabout way, and even like she very much moves away from what a lot of people know her as. And then there was a moment in 1993, or World Youth Day in 1993, where John Paul II was in the United States, in Denver, where there was a Stations of the Cross where there was a woman that played Jesus in the Stations of the Cross. And there's this 30-minute rant on her television program, that's the best way I can call it, where there's a famous line where she points at the camera and she goes, "I'm tired of you liberal church in America." And from there, you have a very different Mother Angelica, where she talks a lot about, even on topics that not related to it, she'll bring up feminism, she'll bring up abortion, she'll bring up all these topics and be very, very, I remember one episode I watched a few weeks ago, because that's what you do when you're 21 doing history projects like Catholicism, where she spent half the episode reading like a prayer that someone sent her where God was a woman, and she went for 30 minutes straight about how it was going to tear down the Catholic Church. And so my main project and thesis is all about how Mother Angelica really started using this populist rhetoric that in that rant on World Youth Day 1993, she talks about how the liberal church is going to destroy the pure, good, regular, everyday Catholic. And it's absolutely fascinating. But what's not even fascinating about that is that it has ramifications and influences today. You see Catholic media today have this idea that there are forces out there trying to destroy authentic Catholic teaching. And it's very much and it's the second generation that grew up watching her, right? So for example, just some things I've seen, this idea that Catholic media can have a real influence on the world. You have far-right Catholic sources. People might be familiar with stuff like Church Militant, which is not condoned by the ecclesiastical body, but they still use the word, like they still claim to be talking in the name of the Catholic Church. Pointing out where LGBT employees are. There was the front page news in the New York Times a few months ago, where there was a church in San Diego, St. John the Evangelist, where Church Militant and LifeSite News, which is it's a Canadian outlet, but a lot of Americans read it, pointed out that there was a pastoral associate who was gay who worked there, and people keyed his car, people spray painted the church, someone threw a punch at him in mass. So like this populist rhetoric that's started in the early 90s has an influence today in how so instead of the liberals being the force in the world, it's the LGBT lobby in the church that's destroying the church, and that good everyday Catholics have to go and combat it. This idea that media can be a force in the real world, that it's a little bit different than that populist idea, but it's still carried on by her. EWTN very went under the radar, just won a law case that allowed them not to give birth control to provide birth control in their healthcare plans, and so that will have a real life effect on people's lives who work there. And this is not just on the conservative right side. This idea that Mother Angelica started, that Catholic media can have like a real role in how people act in the world. We have more left-leaning liberal that you could consider liberal outlets like America, bringing attention to this idea that Catholic organizations that fire LGBT people are being biased because they're not firing people who, for example, cohabitate, right? And this is an idea very much, and it's getting influence in how people think about this issue. And so that's been my research for the year, and I always appreciate feedback and commentary. But I think this idea of the diversity of Catholic viewpoints and having real influence on people's lives is at the point of this book that we're here to talk about today. But also I'm discovering in my own watching of many, many, many hours of Mother Angelica live. So. So thank you. I don't know who's going, where do I put the microphone?
So I think we have... Not working? Yes, working. Okay. So we have an opportunity for some conversation back and forth, and you can do whatever you want. Yes, sir. And
I have a friend.
I'll ask you to respond as you will, but there's no obligation for everybody to respond to every comment or question. Take your choice, please.
My parents were EWTN regulars, watched it all the time. I only watch the Mass because it's something I can relate to, and it's the classic, traditional. But I have a friend who's about my age who watches it for shits and giggles, let's say. And he still goes on about another Angelica, and he predicted that when she died, they'd have a push for her canonization. But it's ironic because I know a lot of older people who listen to the radio, relevant radio, but the guy I know who watches it more than any of them is a guy who watches it for shits and giggles. And goes on and almost yells at the screen, get a job. He's very much against, but it gives him some catharsis to watch this because this is what he grew up with, and he's glad he stopped going to Mass about 10 years ago. So ironically, the person I know, watches her more than any is adversarial towards her, and I can't. I can only watch the Mass, but just to let you know that there are people on both sides who watch her.
Pardon me, this is just for anybody. Some of us are of a mind that we're facing a real ecological catastrophe, and as a human species, and that we must, as Francis makes unambiguously clear in Laudato Si, act now and act decisively. And I'm just curious, or I would like to hear, to what degree where the church is at least at that kind of highest level of authority in terms of what it's saying about the environment, ecology, eco-justice, and so forth, environmental justice. Is there any pull of that for young people like yourselves as a way of either reconnecting or strengthening connectedness to the church? Or is it that young people now would be, they seem to be more awakening to this, as evidenced by more recently student strikes, in relationship to environmental issues, climate crisis. Or is it that young people are already sort of sensitized to this, and what the Catholic Church says or doesn't say about this isn't in and of itself going to help in terms of keeping them connected, if you will? Or you see what I'm asking?
I have 3 quick thoughts on that. The first, the book that I mentioned, Chappell ended his presentation at the symposium by saying, okay, so we're studying totalitarianism in Europe post-World War I. What does that mean for today? And he said, first, anti-authoritarianism. Second, we need to act as consuming families, as Catholics, and understand the ramifications of our materialism and our consumerism towards climate change. He said, if we're understanding the economy, there won't be an economy in 10 years if we continue on the path that we're on. And so he mentioned Laudato Si. But then that brings me into my second point. As a young person, we're not interacting with official church documents, synod documents, encyclicals, unless, first of all, they're assigned in a class, or second, if America Magazine or the media, gives us a consumable, interactive tweet, right? So top 10 things you need to know about Laudato Si. That's something I would click on and read, right? And that would be my takeaway. And so...
That's another obvious venue.
Absolutely. Well, but so I would say in a young Catholic's everyday life, those aren't things that we're hearing on the pulpit all the time. And the way that we're interacting with these documents are in tweetable comments, right? Little things that the Pope sends out, or these documents distributed by the media. And so I know that has had a profound effect, though, on a lot of different Catholics in my everyday life. I think I might be in a very homogeneous environment here at Loyola. My freshman year, we were ranked the 4th greenest school in the United States, right? And so this was something at the forefront of each of our lectures, was this idea of ecology. And I don't know if that's true for the everyday Catholic, and that's why I bring up this idea of interacting with Laudato Si in these little bites that allow you to kind of grasp onto the teaching. But the last thing I'll end with was, it's something now, continuing with this idea of media, Notre Dame has an outlet called the Grotto Network, and there's a lot of Catholic Instagrammers, I guess you could say, that young people are interacting with. I think it's a new idea of evangelization, and all of these outlets that I personally follow, and I know have like 1,000 or more followers, are talking about slow fashion, right? So being able to wear clothing all year round, something that you're not continually shopping and throwing away your clothes, right? So living ecologically in your fashion choices. But then also, Grotto Network specifically I bring up because they have been talking about giving up excessive waste during Lent, like using Lent as, and I think someone mentioned that last night, using Lent as a way of giving up something that causes ecological damage. And the thing that I'll end with, my friend Sarah actually took up the full challenge. She's doing it as a research project, but she's given up all waste for Lent. And so you might have seen her, she was grabbing stuff along our buffet using a fork she brought from home and Tupperware, because she's refusing to throw away anything all Lent. And seeing this as a fellow young Catholic, this is a challenge that I want to take up, right? Like I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, if Sarah saw me throwing this away right now. But that translates into Jesus seeing me throw this away right now. So I think it is something that needs to be talked about more on the pulpit, but ultimately is being consumed in these little microbites on social media for young Catholics.
There were two things that came to my mind. One was that when Pope Francis was elected, I was like a junior in high school, and then Laudato Si came out my freshman year of college. I think that his election and then his his specific pastoral response really rejuvenated Catholics, and then Laudato Si just like snowballed it even greater. And I think in the lived experience, it's kind of died down in the last few years, especially since some of the sex abuse crisis stuff in Pennsylvania. But like the lived experience, you're asking if people think about environmental crisis after Laudato Si, I think every young Catholic was kind of at least thinking about it in some way. And I just want to reiterate, like as a young person, I do kind of wish that priests did talk more about it from the pulpit. I'm kind of tired of personal morality like every single time, and like we finally have a pope whose encyclicals aren't like in the line of Humanae Vitae and stuff like that has like a real political socio crisis facing our world, and priests aren't talking about it. I don't know. It's kind of disappointing. I think that's the best the word I can think about it. Disappointing. But some people are, which is great. And knowing how our society is going with the raising of temperature, I think Catholic churches are going to have to talk about it in 10, 20, 30 years as more climate catastrophes happen, because it is a social justice issue.
So personally, I find it very encouraging. And I think Laudato Si in particular is an excellent example of a responsible engagement with another sphere of knowledge. The impact that I think it has, I think is more nuanced. One thing is that I've taught Laudato Si in a class, and you always get a range of reactions to any text that you assign. But one reaction I get is, the Pope believes in science, So there's sort of, we were talking about, the baseline that we're working with, and just the general lack of belief that a religious tradition can speak meaningfully to any sort of current issue that I think is widespread among those demographics who tend to be disaffiliating from traditional institutions and organizations at a larger level. And the second thing that I want to point out is that Laudato Si was received well among the exact people that you would think it would be received well among. And I was working as a summer research assistant for a professor here at Loyola who does work with climate change and specifically Jesuit activism around that, and I was doing some research into what parishes in Illinois have organizations around the environment and environmental protection, and it was very much divided between urban parishes that did and rural and suburban parishes that didn't. And if you look at parish websites, the focus is often either life issues, mainly abortion, not all of the seamless garment, or social justice and green faith, and very rarely both. So that's a problem as well, I think, that, you know, the segment of the church that you would think would receive it well, did receive it well, and I don't know what that tells us. But personally, I'm encouraged that we do speak to these issues as Catholics.
Very briefly, they've sort of led into this, so I'm going to go ahead and say it. The Pope's voice is incredibly important. It still is, and people that are inclined to hear it will hear it. Following my thread of polarization, it's interesting, though, that the people who are determined to not hear it will not hear it. If you are the kind of person, and so Francis has spoken against many of our current American president's policies, sort of indirectly. Folks that like the current American president tend to then dislike Pope Francis and believe any number of things such that they don't have to accept the teaching of the Pope as in any way authoritative or correct or binding on these issues. You see it on a lot of internet forums where people will come in and find every way in the world in which they don't have to conform themselves to this kind of teaching. So the polarization has reached the point where people that used to say you have to obey the Pope will find new ways to disobey the Pope and to ignore that teaching because of the depth of polarization.
I have a question. Bill mentioned that, you know, the question increasingly for young people, which I would be interested in your reaction, was, you know, not who's Catholic, but why remain Catholic, why be Catholic? And I'd like to ask about not only that, but also a question, an issue which has not come up at all, but which I think is out there, I can say this is anti-Catholicism. Is that, where does this anti-Catholicism, is that a real thing? Is it something, you know, you respond to? Is it you know, what do you say?
I don't really believe that there's anti-Catholicism as to the levels of like late 19th century America in modern day, and to the point where I think Americans are, not Americans, I mean Catholics are very well cultured to the American society. I think in very rare exceptions do you see Catholic belief being like something talked about in like the political sphere as being a barrier to something. I think the latest thing was that when the president was running Supreme Court nominees, one of them was asked if like her Catholic belief on the death penalty would prevent her from ruling in death penalty cases. And that's like one, and that was a big issue. So I think that was like the only example I can think about in the public sphere. Yeah, but I don't really consider anti-Catholicism to be a strong force in American society.
I would agree with that. I've seen it, but it's toothless kind of at this point. Whereas it used to be a lot more harmful, I think. My husband was raised Southern Baptist, and he was repeatedly told, you know, don't marry a nice Catholic girl. And I said, well, I'm not nice, so that worked out well. So it is there. There is that rhetoric. I think, you know, in terms of the larger culture, I don't think that's one of the bigger fish we have to fry. To return to your earlier question of why remain, why be Catholic, I think for me it almost is that sort of here comes everybody thing that you're talking about. I, for a while, was considering leaving the church. I was sort of loosely Christian and going to different churches, and I was in grad school and I read Karl Rahner and I was like, oh no, I'm still Catholic. And that coupled with an experience of a really vibrant campus Catholic community and being placed in a leadership role, honestly, before I was fully committed, was powerful. And so I think, involvement and being entrusted with stakeholding, and then also, just the richness of the intellectual, artistic, cultural tradition. I mean, it's not, it's hard to leave, so.
I have a slightly different experience of whether anti-Catholicism exists. The county that I was born in, the Catholic population there is about 3% of the overall Catholic population, and there is a visceral anti-Catholicism, both in regards to doctrine and recently, in light of abuse scandals, suspicion as to what kind of person a Catholic might really be. Combine this with sort of the practical religious realities that Southern Baptists and many evangelicals don't drink and Catholics do, and you have a reputation for licentiousness and morality that still persists in some areas. That's real. Yep, for sure. Yeah, so that's on the sort of more conservative side when Catholicism is not a large part of the culture. Chicago is an incredibly Catholic city. It's over 30% nominally Catholic anyway. And I just moved from, just 5 years ago, moved from St. Louis, which is like 20-something% Catholic, and it's a very Catholic city. So you don't experience it as much there. All it takes in a population is about 20% Catholicism. It seems like people acclimate and accept people really well. Interestingly, we see similar kinds of things. People that have LGBTQ family members, cousins, things like that, suddenly prejudice goes down when you know people that are different from you. What do you know? The other side, though, is there is a liberal side to this as well. And it tracks very well with the same kind of thing you see with reactions to police brutality. How can you support an institution that so often shelters its abusers? How can you go there week after week? How can you give them money? How can you name yourself as among this institution that abuses children? And that's still very real, and I encounter it, and my friends are polite, but they've had some real conversations for me, and there have been some confrontations where, we have to have this conversation. And I have to make the analogy to police, and I have to make the analogy to school systems and to all kinds of other institutions that are lauded and valuable in society in some ways and deeply problematic in other ways. And it still doesn't actually resolve the issue. So I think it's right that it's not 18th century caricatures of bishops crawling onto the American shores like crocodiles, 19th century. Maybe. But it's still very alive, and I think it does come into national discourse every once in a while.
Alrighty then, thank you. So I think I'm going to turn the microphone over to my co-editor, and we'll have a few concluding comments and bring down the curtain.
I will keep mine brief. I grew up in a rural parish with a pastor who believed people could listen only as long as he could stand on his toes. And I have been incredibly moved by the presence and attentiveness of everybody here. So I have 3 brief things to say. The first is a huge thank you. The second is a massive sigh of relief that our younger Catholic panelists actually found the book useful and not totally out to lunch. That means a lot to me as a dinosaur. And the third is to say that this book is part of doing this book is really part of a larger question that has animated me since I was actually growing up on the farm in the pre-Vatican II church, which is how do, and it is the big question for our time, how does wisdom in our world today, which is so fluid and so interest-based and so networked, how does it get passed beyond from the lifespan of a single age cohort? Pretty much everything we learned about how to do that until the middle 20th century, we learned at the corner of Reformation and Enlightenment on the Monopoly Board of History. And that square on the Board of History used to be high rent, and now it's mostly a sinkhole. And so to have such incredible colleagues of newer generations still interested in the question of what the narrative of Catholicism and its teachings can bring to us is profoundly heartening. So thank you so very much.
That's it? All right. Okay, I think I've got my marching orders. Short and sweet. I want to add a particular thank you here, well, to two entities. First, to Patricia, who really has kept the train moving, and during some hard periods in her life, and this has been, you know, a long project, and I hope it's been a sustaining one through the hardship. I also have to pay. We haven't mentioned it, but and none of you need know this. But this is the project of which this is a part, and this particular volume received funding from the Lilly Endowment and various people's honoraria and things like that paid by them, and so those people down in Indianapolis deserve a thanks, as well as our guests here. I would say that just a couple of words of substance, if I may. This phenomenon that we keep referring to, the rise of the nuns, which has now gotten to the point where it no longer gets a laugh because people know what you're talking about. You know, it's not the Catholic sisters, but yes, those other people who say they have no religion. It is a phenomenon that began to be noticed actually by colleagues of mine, or they became colleagues, with a survey in 2001 called the American Religious Identification Survey, which is a follow-up to a large survey that came out, it was very large, a decade earlier, in which, to their surprise, Andrew mentioned this morning that there was a slight difference in a change of questions which may have disguised it, but the main thing is that this initial survey didn't attract much attention because the results were published in November of 2001, and no one was interested in hearing anything about the decline of religion. I mean, that was not a journalistic question. It was, you know, where are the Muslims, and what do they want from us after 9/11? And those academics who studied this phenomenon wondered whether this doubling from 1990 to 2001 of the proportion of nuns in the country, whether that wasn't some kind of statistical aberration, just even though, you know, they had asked a sample of 60,000, whether there wasn't something wrong about that. But the data proved right. And interestingly, across the board, I mean, every region of the country experienced a doubling or tripling of the number of people who answered the question that way, across religious groupings and so on. And what we have seen, and I don't know if it's comforting or the opposite, but every religious tradition, including the conservative churches, are not growing. There was a famous book that posed that years ago, why the conservative churches are growing, making the argument that tough religion, that demanding religion was what people wanted, and all of the soft liberalism that one saw was just giving people reasons not to show up. And there's no doubt that some tough religion in that way has proved attractive, but across the broad spectrum of society, not so much. I mean, one has to say against Christian teaching that a lot of the strength of religion or religious institutions in a society like ours depends on the lukewarm, and has in the past. And when the lukewarm no longer feel that they need to show up, you know, they stop doing it, and what we are left with is moves towards the kind of polarization between those people who are not interested at all, in some cases actively not interested, but in many cases indifferent to religion, and those who are quite committed. And that's just another one of those polarizations that we're struggling with in our society. What interested us, and I'm not going to go on very long here, but about this whole phenomenon was that different religious traditions had different approaches, different understandings of the role of choice and the role of ascription in their communities. In my own Jewish community, ascribed religious identity is incredibly important. I mean, not just because people would, you know, identify you hostilely as a Jew, but because the way Jewish identity is conceived in Judaism antedates the kind of commitment that Christians learned to make early on, and that Muslims make, and so an ethno-religious identity is absolutely core to Jewish self-understanding, and in fact, converts to Judaism are called Jews by choice, which is to say, the rest of us are not. And so the challenge of understanding religious identity as a chosen identity in the Jewish community is very, very great. For those people in other traditions, particularly evangelicals, who must all, even if they come from a long line of Southern Baptists, you know, hit the sawdust trail, have to accept Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior. Chosenness is built into the tradition. And I would say that Catholics fall somewhere in between, particularly cases of ethnic identity, place them there. And so each of these traditions have to grapple with their own resources, their own opportunities, their own shortcomings in terms of adjusting to the new reality of religious identity in America. And so I will say thanks again for coming, and good luck with that.